I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the future of agronomy, and I'm going to make 3 points. One's related to making the claim that agronomy has been an annual project, annualizing crops and annualizing sustainable intensification. Second, I'm going to talk about, guess what, Pigeonpea, if you might know me, that's not a surprise. And then, as a case study, and then also third, sort of the history of perennial grains. Sort of we can learn from how it's changed over time. But most of all today, I want you to think about, as we just heard, what is the future of agronomy and what would be your future like if you could envision a more sustainable, intensified, or sustainable future. So can you just close your eyes a minute now? This is not the after coffee break snooze time, but just close your eyes if you would, okay? Most people can't follow this instruction, but okay, so close your eye. Now just smell maybe just rain just came, you're in the middle of a field. Do you hear the wind going through some sort of leaves? Perhaps you hear some farmers talking. So what is the sustainable agriculture, sustainable intensified field that you can imagine? So just keep that in your mind, okay? Okay, you can open your eyes. And this is what many agronomists, at least in my part of the world, in southern Africa and also Michigan, would see as, as really well-nourished maize. That would be a really sustainable project. Some people would see aim with trees, right? With that vision for sustainable intensification. Others might, think of green manures or other kind of legumes, again, to intercrop with, a really high-producing cereal, high harvest index maize that can, give us a lot of calories, a lot of income, hopefully, from our input. So this is one vision. Perhaps you had other visions. And in fact, it turns out in Malawi, of course, I always give examples from Malawi, I've worked so long, that in fact, there was another, in 1885, and in fact, up to as recent as 1940, there was something called perennial sorghum by the anthropologists, and sometimes it's called biennial sorghum. It is a sorghum that is ratooned. Sometimes it's also said to be coming right from the roots, and there's actually a new genetic, you'll hear about later, the actual new type of sorghum crossed to perennial relatives that is actual perennial sorghum. But anyway, so it's called a perennial sorghum in literature. And the interesting thing is it's said to be able to produce yield on very poor shingly soil, as we hear here, that would not support maize. But the real project, especially if you look at some of the documentation from the 1940s, was for a more annualized maize, sole crop maize future. And that's still with us today in Malawi. And in fact, from this same anthropology, review of the anthropology literature, we find that in the 1940s there was a big famine, and perennial sorghum was one of the top 3 things that way people survived that. Along with winter gardens and out-migration to people in to relatives in other countries. That's how people survived that drought. But at the same time, the policies at that time were to suppress perennial sorghum, which they did a very good job of, and that was partly because of worry about it being a disease reservoir. Okay, so it's been with us, but has been suppressed and is no longer very important. And I would say that annualizing generally, here we have sorghum from West Africa, and if anyone's ever seen that, it's a really extraordinary creature, sorghum, as it's grown in much of West Africa. Unlike the really modern sorghums that are maybe your height, the traditional types are all 3 times my height, right? They're really tall, 9 meters or so. So you can see these more modern varieties get shorter and shorter. And so improving the harvest index has been one of the major ways that the Green Revolution has been about, because that allows you to put fertilizer on and then the plant produces that big grain. And then here's Pigeonpea, told you it would come. So on the left we have the traditional land races that are grown as intercrops, and what? Ratoon for 2 or 3 years. So basically grown as a perennial often with maize or with sorghum. And then what has happened to that? Well, breeders are now working on it and making a much shorter, erect type, high yielding. Sometimes I call it, at least in the Malawi context, and forgive me, but I call it a pathetic soybean, because it doesn't have any of the robustness of insect tolerance that soybean, and it requires 4 to 5 sprays of pesticide. In fact, the new DDG of research Peter Codbury, said, well, I consider a pigeonpea a non-starter in Africa. He likes to be controversial. But his point was that since all the breeders tell him it takes 4 sprays of pesticide, why would we promote it, right? But in fact, there's many varieties and land races, and certainly, hopefully, some coming down the pipe from Ickersat and other pigeonpea breeders that are tolerant of pests. But this is recently from a pigeonpea meeting in India. The new research priorities are erect type, super early. So trying to, again, produce these annualized pigeonpea. And in fact, from my own experience in Malawi, farmers are very interested in these annuals. We would try and promote green manures and agroforestry systems, Quercidia, Trifosia, do beautiful on research stations, as shown there, as we heard earlier. Improve varieties of beans, groundnut, soybean. But one thing we noticed is that farmers kept picking those up, and the only thing that was improving the soil was what I call a third way, or resilient legume. This is pigeonpea again, and it's giving you a lot of vegetation, but you can also see that it gives you food. And so there's not just pigeonpea, there's other examples of this. And it's not a full perennial grain, but it can be grown for 1 or 2 years. Perennial cowpea, runner bean, which only really grows well in sort of colder environments. And then lab was actually an indigenous legume throughout much of Eastern Africa, and it's still preferred by Kikuyu and others in Kenya. So there are other types. It's not just a third way, it's not just pigeonpea, as some people seem to think. But anyways, there is potential to develop this sort of intermediate. But it's interesting that these are so neglected, and I'm going to give a case study of pigeonpea, that they keep being removed from projects after they're originally there, especially pigeonpea. And its perenniality is completely ignored. So this is what farmers do, they red tune it, and so they get a second crop, which should be quite prolific. And in fact, in our own work, we at first promoted an annual use. We'd uproot pigeonpea. Because after all, I usually have 2 years of grant funding, if I'm lucky. Master's students take 2 years, and so you think of things in 2-year time frames. But farmers kept, in some of their tryouts or baby trials, they would experiment and grow it into 2 or 3 years. So we started trying to think about trials that went on for 4 years and a little more complex. We also found that there's a recent widespread adoption of a new kind of sport, or possibly genetic improved varieties, so debated where it's coming from, has very thick stems. So farmers, and they're using it for fuel wood quite broadly. So in fact, there's many reasons why farmers are interested in crops beyond their yields, which wouldn't come as a surprise, and yet still is not really considered much. So in a recent survey around different parts of Malawi, from the north, Mzimba, to the center, Kasungu, to the south, where farmers do grow pigeonpea quite broadly, in Zomba area, postdoc of mine, Paul Roger, looked at, are farmers ratooning? So are they growing pigeonpea as a perennial? Now remember that in the Malawi Guide to Agriculture, it only refers to pigeonpea as an annual, so there's no recommendations. Nobody's tested pigeonpea for its ability to ratoon, and yet it turns out almost 50% of farmers are still ratooning in some of their fields, and these are some of the reasons. Seed savings is, interestingly, a major reason. Soil fertility only came out in sort of the newer area they were growing at Kasungu. Almost everyone was looking for that second crop of pigeonpea. So there are also farmers not ratooning, so we have to keep that in mind. Again, disease reservoir or increased disease came out, so we have to remember that as a potential problem with perennials, that they can be a disease reservoir or insect reservoir. They didn't necessarily see a benefit, and then of course this is Malawi, so competition with maize. Maize is life, so if it competes with maize, there's that seems as a big problem. And so in complementary work, Kurt Waldman worked to do some choice experiments. If you're not familiar with choice experiments, basically the idea is that you are giving farmers a whole range of choices, kind of giving cards that let them choose between a reduction in maize, a slight reduction in maize, and an increase in pigeonpea yield. A slight reduction in maize and an increase in biomass. So what are the choices that you would make? A big reduction in maize, would you choose that if you had a huge reduction in soil fertility, an increase in soil fertility, so in the far future you would improve your soils? So they kind of look at these trade-offs in terms of if you grew pigeon pea as a perennial, would you be interested in the trade? Well, the perenniality is just barely above 0. So yes, 80% of people are interested in as a perennial, but they're just barely positive about it. On the other hand, if they thought they could get a big jump in soil fertility, then you start to see about 75% are very interested in it. So in contradiction to our other study, which didn't show soil fertility really came out for why people were attuned, in a choice experiment, farmers did really look for pigeon pea as a soil fertility promoter. And we found another paper that's coming out of this work is that there's really 3 different ways. People are not just using pigeon pea in one way. In some parts of the country, they didn't really care about yield at all. It's really as a soil fertility improver. Other parts, it's a market. It goes all the way to India. It's really a market-driven, particularly the male farmers were really looking for a market. And another area that we've seen more as giving a little forage, a little bit, it was just kind of as a complement to what else they're doing, but having all these different features. So we have to remember there's different locations, different farmers may be looking for different things. And in our rush to annualize and to focus on the maize, we may be losing some of these other benefits that are out there. So, okay, I've shown you some of the benefits, interests in pigeon pea potentially, but I'm not going to go into all these details, and these aren't my story to tell. Some of them, why they were at the last minute cut out of a big Gates, actually into for Africa, for example, why it was cut out of the integrated nutrient value chain project in Malawi. But I can tell you, because I was there, as an agronomist when I joined ICRSAF in the early 1990s, I had been finding from my own work that pigeon pea had this really interesting role to play because it seemed to be the only green manure that farmers were interested in because it provided some food. And yet, it turned out they'd almost shut down the entire pigeon pea research program. And then I hear it's under some debate whether to continue it. And so, I think these intermediate things that are kind of gray, they're not fully agroforestry, not a tree, they're kind of a bush, a shrub, somehow don't resonate or somehow are seen as not important. And then other projects that looked at agroforestry overlooked an agroforestry tree that actually provides some food. So sometimes I call it always the bridesmaid, never the bride. I don't know if you have that saying, but basically it's never front and center, is it? So I think from the pigeon pea case study we can take away a couple key points. That farmers do indeed value annuals, and that we should, we can't forget that. They need that return to their input. Some, on the other hand, are retuning, so they are evaluating the perenniality despite no investment, no training about that. Our research vision, I'm claiming, is all annual. You may dispute that. I'm saying that even agroforestry is all about improving the annual system. Pigeon pea grains were grown, perennial grains, including ratoon sorghum and pigeon pea were grown historically in some parts of Africa, in Mali and in Malawi. But intensification remains this annual project. So, I want to also go through a little bit of history about, I have very different numbers up here than you do.
Good.
There's 12, so. We live in different time universes.
Sorry.
Okay, so perennial wheatgrass is one of the ancestors that gives the perennial traits. It's been crossed with annual wheat. And this, although it's from National Geographic, is much better than any pictures I could take of roots. There's actually one reason I got interested in perennial grains. I've always been about cover crops and pigeon pea, which turned out to be a perennial, but I never thought of it that way. I was always about annuals, but one of my students started growing these new perennial wheats from this cross, and we dug up pits, because we like to look at roots, and at a field day, and we started to see, I started to think, every time I get a cover crop going, what do farmers do? They have to grow their cash crop, right? So they kill it. We're really good at getting the annuals to grow, and we kill them, or we harvest them, and then they kill them. So, potatoes, rice, all of these are traditionally, they actually are biologically, a lot of them are perennials, but we We're going to spray them so that they die. So anyways, so you can't really get a massive root system when you're always doing that. Even if you have a cover crop there, it provides a lot of above ground. But we know more and more that soil carbon is coming like 80% or so from the roots, indirectly and directly. So interesting that we haven't focused much on another option to perennial grains. So this is perennial wheat and perennial rye. You can see it's not one animal, it's many different types. This is annual wheat in front, perennial rye, and then a bunch of perennial wheat. So we've been growing it in Michigan. And we find consistently about half the yield. Now, breeders will say, well, this is really unfair because this has been a hobby for them. They'll be very happy to tell you at great length about how they've received no money to really develop this as real varieties. So they probably could get the yield up. And even so, in some years we get 2 tons. So annual will be 4 tons, but we get 2 tons. So it's a really respectable yield. But, this is a real problem. I thought. We did a bunch of interviews with organic farmers. It's coming out in Renewable Ag and Food Systems soon. And they actually said, no, they don't care about the yield. They want to grow this in riparian areas. They want to grow it as a specialty crop. They don't, 2 tons fine. So it's really probably more about the traits, which need to be improved before this could be really a commercial crop. So it needs a lot of work. It's not as high yielding as annuals. That's important to know. And it is the crop that's been around the longest. I mean, we have a intensive look at all of perennial grain bibliography. And you can see it goes back to the 1950s. There's a lot of work in Russia. Why? Why do you think they looked at perennial wheat and perennial rye? Because there was some famines in, and they didn't have enough seed. And so they thought, well, if we could keep regrowing this our main crop, it came out of food security concerns. So early on, I'm not going to go through all this in detail, but rice has come up in more recent years, partly because Erie did sort of a blue sky investment in perennial rice, and China has continued. Sorghum, very recent. Pigeonpea is very, very small there. And the one last thing I want to point out, perennial grains as a concept in white there really was only thought about in the last 2 decades. We didn't even have the idea of a perennial grain as a more general concept and there's also, as you'll see here, been interest in, this is using topic modeling. This is coming out of probably the whole algorithms being developed to figure out what are the topics in your social media cloud that's around you. But anyways, there's been really jumps in the software that can help you understand, looking through abstracts, what are the different topics that emerge. And over time, you'll see the first topic was basically just developing a perennial grain, right? Perennial, annual, hybrid. So this was like they were trying to produce a perennial wheat and then a perennial grain more generally. The second topic that's really became big in the 80s is kind of a farming systems topic. I think out of farming systems, people realized that rice and sorghum and pigeonpea were being ratooned. Then it kind of went away. And then the third topic is this whole idea of environment, soil, so perennial grains as an environmental good started to come forward. So finally, I want to leave you with this pictures from Tanzania recently of lablab. So you'll see in a real erratic rainfall area that the lablab looks like it's dead, and maize did die, but it came back when the rains came back. So this is where I'm starting to call these resilient legumes, since we couldn't get traction with my semi-perennial legumes. So I was coming up with new terms, right? I tried to say this is a form of conservation agriculture, but I've given that up. You can't change what conservation ag is, so you have to come up with other ways to think about them. So these resilient legumes are giving us leaves and grain that people can eat in these really poor and very erratic environments. And then also providing some vegetation that can improve the soil. But that said, I think that they still are very much only an option. I don't really imagine a whole landscape full of perennial grains. Some people from the Land Institute you may know have what they consider the strong vision of, and what I consider to be more practical, which would be new options for farmers, including perennials and ratooned crops, which is considered the weak vision of perennial grains. So I'm a weak vision person. I think we need to have a range of options for farmers, and perhaps we've overlooked some. So finally, I just want to leave you with which vision. Agronomy, is it just an annual vision? But I think most people would agree that perennials play a role in sustainable intensification because of those roots, because of that vegetation. But should the perennials be complements to the annuals? Should they always be agroforestry green manures, or could they also provide some food? And then I think one of the more interesting questions is why have perennial grains and some of these semi-indeterminate legumes and seeds, why have they been overlooked? So I hope that'll get the conversation going.
Good.